Hi there, so I'm Griselda Goldsborough and I'm co-curator of Aesthetica Arts Prize, and I'm very excited today to introduce you to some of our artists that are shortlisted for the 2021 prize. Hi, so as co-curator of the Art Prize at Aesthetica, we are really delighted with the entrance this year, and we've got a really great hour for you. So from 2 till 3 today, we've got the artists, 6 of the artists. We've got Monica Alcazar Duarte, Andrew Leventez, Chris Combs, James Tatscott, Alice Duncan, and Caesar and Lewis Collective. And these are all artists that are working internationally across some of the most pressing themes. And we're really excited to hear their tales from creating the art to presenting theirs in the prize this year. So without further ado, because we've only got 6 minutes each from them, and then we're going to go into some chat. If you've got any questions, do ask us, but we will be hearing about their practice now. So we're going to start with the wonderful Monica Alcazar Duarte, and she'll be talking about her work.
Thank you, Griselda. My name is Monica Alcazar Duarte. I'm originally from Mexico, but have been living in London for almost 19 years. It's going to be this year now. I'm going to talk to you about Second Nature, the project that has been shortlisted for the award this year. And this project is based on algorithms and bias. I don't know if we can go to the PowerPoint. Thank you, Matt. And play the first video, please. So between 2017, 2018, and 2019, I don't know if we can play the video, Matt, if that's possible. Maybe not. So I'm just going to traveling between the US, the UK, and Mexico. And I started performing a series of web searches with the terms Mexicans, Mexicans are, Mexican women, why are Mexicans considered? And depending on the geography, these web searches changed, which I found fascinating because whenever I think of the internet, I think that is neutral and that is all encompassing. No matter where you are, you will get the same information. But then I discovered that this was not the case. So parallel to this, go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you. Parallel to this, I started making interviews to friends, my family, friends of friends, then strangers in Mexico, and asked them if they had any kind of story of discrimination while being abroad. And I was shocked to hear that from 100 people that I interviewed, they all had a story to tell. So when I came back to London and applied for a small grant, I got it. I was fortunate enough to get it, went into the studio and ended up with a series of 20 portraits. It is me in these photographs. And what these photographs are, more kind of an inspiration from all these stories that stayed with me throughout this year and a half that I was interviewing people. And what I'm trying to do with these photographs is to kind of make this othering that I feel certain groups go through, in which you lose your face, you are all amalgamated and lumped together in a series of very limited meaning that is assigned to you. The other thing that I'm really interested in through this project is to make algorithms visible, as I feel that that's what is unseen and that is not very well understood. We don't see the impact in people's real lives. We don't see the real impact of the internet and the web searches we make and how the images are presented to us in the order and the way it's curated, how it has an impact in people's real lives. So some of the images, as I was showing, have drawings with metallic inks on top of it. And these are kind of algorithmic paths that I discovered through visualizing algorithms. And some images have an augmented reality app. So if we could go to the video, the second video, Matt, please, just to show the app demo very quickly. I would really appreciate it. The reason for which I decided to use Thank you. The reason for which I decided to use augmented reality again was to make the invisible visible, to make a physical connection with that I feel is very intangible and doesn't exist in the real world. And so finally, as a final note of the exhibition, if you go to the exhibition, the physical exhibition in York, don't forget to download the app. There's a link with the photographs. But also, this is something that is going to affect us all eventually. The way that meaning is being assigned in our world today through these unseen technologies is not in a neutral manner, and it's not in an all-encompassing manner. I always thought of the internet as something that if we search, you would get the same knowledge wherever you are, no matter where you are. And it appears that it's not. So when I was in Mexico, it was very much about community and local politics, as you can imagine. When I was in the UK, it was pretty much about food. And when I was in the US, it was about illegal immigration and violence. And so this very, very specific assigned meaning that I realized that is being curated, it actually seeps back into real life, and it seeps back into people's lives. And so that's more or less in a nutshell what the project I'm presenting is. And at the end, here is my handle on social media. If you want to stay in touch after the talk, or you want to collaborate, the reason I've done this work is because I'm very interested to enter into a dialogue with an SEO, a search engine optimizer, or with coders or technologists. I want these technologies to improve, and this collaboration in between humans and machines that is so much talked about these days, that really can be improved and can really happen in a more kind of equal way. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That's fantastic. It's so interesting to hear about that work. And I think we'll pick up on that later about the different technologies that you're using, in complete contrast to Andrew Leventis, who uses painting as a medium. And we always get some great applications from fine artists, but we were really interested in his work, particularly in the last year that we've had. So I will let him, without further ado, have his 6 minutes to see what he can tell us about his art practice. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Monica for a really fascinating presentation there. I appreciate everyone taking the time to see my work and hear some of my ideas, and I'm really looking forward to being introduced to more of the panelists' work as well. So I do have a few images to share as I'm talking, and I was wondering if it would be possible to put up the freezer box Vanitas painting. It's the kind of horizontally oriented image. There we are. Thank you. Okay, so the title for this one is Freezer Box or Icebox Vanitas. And I thought I would include the term Vanitas in the title for reasons that maybe I can talk about a little bit later on in our discussion. But basically, the situation here is my freezer being overstuffed at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is a piece going back to March 2020, right at the outset here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm kind of in the southeastern part of the US. So this situation crept up on me. Usually my freezer and my refrigerator is completely empty, like probably don't have anything in it at all. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I was really overstocking everything and feeling the kind of ensuing panic that was coming on with the pandemic. So what I did is I kind of saw this scene one day, and I shot some photos of it first, and then I began to formulate how I could perhaps make a painting from it. And with all of the work that I do, I really don't like to stage the objects at all. I mainly make still life paintings, and I really like to just kind of wander into the situation that I see and make a painting of it and try not to curate it or present it too much. So I should also mention about this work, the pandemic really did change the work that I was doing in the studio a lot. This is a much more kind of industrial object than I've ever painted in the past. Meaning that previous to this, I was painting kind of older objects in house museums, toys, paper theaters, leather-bound books, antiques, things like this. Never something that's nearly as kind of stark of an object and plastic. Usually things that I'm painting are in a state of advanced decay, or they're much older than I am. So this was very different. And maybe a thing that's important to say about this too is that I think looking back on making this work, it's evident now in a way that maybe wasn't evident to me then, that I was feeling a lot of anxieties about the times. And I think those anxieties come through in the painting a bit, meaning, again, like, where am I going to be able to buy art supplies from? How am I going to get essential items for the house? If the situation with the pandemic gets too bad, where am I going to get food? Everything was kind of new about the situation back then. So I'm trying to pay attention in this sense to things that I live with and things that I live with every day, but I never really spend much time looking at. So I think, overall, this was a very precarious time. I don't know if I have time. I do have one more image that perhaps I could share quickly. It's the taller refrigerator painting. There should be an image of it there. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So the bottom piece is on canvas. It's about 3.5 feet wide by about 5.5 feet tall. And then the upper one is just a little bit smaller. And so I was really happy that I'm going to be able to exhibit both of these pieces together in the Aesthetica Art Prize, because the freezer box painting kind of led into a series where then I painted the bottom half of the refrigerator. And so it appears that the pieces will be together in the exhibit, kind of how I had intended. So thanks. Maybe I'll just save some more of my thoughts for the Q&A, perhaps.
Thank you, Andrew. I love those paintings, and actually, I love the vanitas as a medium. And in lots of my, I work in audience engagement quite a lot, and it's so fascinating still, the vanitas as a talking piece, as a way to engage people. So I'll be really interested in picking your brains about that later, because I've worked with some of the sort of 17th century paintings, and I know you've researched them. So it'd be really interesting in this, how this has changed in this last year. So that's fascinating. And in the same way, going to Chris Coons, our next artist, working with audience engagement, thinking about how his work, the Smiling Faces, uses that audience engagement as well. So maybe he can tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. And
by all means.
Chris.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Chris Combs, and I am an artist in Washington, D.C., working with technology. And I both embrace and question technology in my work. I have some slides, if you don't mind pulling those up when we get a sec. But I design and create circuit boards, assemble all their components with solder and tweezers and whatnot. I design software, and then also manipulate found objects and metal, plastic, and wood to make cases for each of the machines. So this is my piece for the Aesthetica Art Prize, which is Morale is Mandatory is the title of it. And what it does is it actually looks for faces around the artwork. And if it sees a face and determines that it is using a neural network and a pre-trained network, if it determines that you're happy enough, then it shows you on its meter of smiling faces. And it just, it ticks it up on this meter here. And one of the interesting things to me is that the artwork is actually just built around a very simple kit, which is sold for school children at the discount chain Target by Google. The Google AIY kit allows kids to use facial recognition technologies using easy, inexpensive hardware, and lets you learn how to make all kinds of interesting software that uses it. And one of the examples is a smile detection kit, just like what I'm doing with this artwork. I use their sample code almost without modification. I find it really interesting that Google, which is in a position to immensely profit from the use of artificial intelligence and facial recognition and other such tracking technologies, has no mention whatsoever of the ethical implications of facial recognition, or whether you should be using it at all, in all of the extensive product documentation for the Google AIY Vision Kit. So I find that interesting. It's something that our children are learning from without any sort of coaching from the big guy about how to actually use the technology. The physical form of the piece is an industrial enclosure. You can see here again on the right, it's an electrical enclosure, a found object, and I embedded into it a World War II era milliampere meter and modified the face of that with a contemporary pigment inkjet replica. And otherwise you see the camera and a few lights. Here are a few of my other pieces here. I try to work at kind of larger scales where I can. So at the top row there, you'll see a piece of public art that I just installed. And I have other kind of pieces that are smaller and lit up and self-illuminated. And my work tends to address themes of surveillance, artificial intelligence, control, and algorithmic bias. So that's my work in a nutshell.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks. That's fantastic. I'll be interested to hear some more about that because I think it is audience engagement I'm really interested in. And I remember seeing your piece when I was looking through, it's probably over a year ago now when you applied. And it'd be interesting to hear some more tales from everybody about why people apply for the Aesthetica Art Prize as well. So from technology and light to landscape and light in a way, I'd like to introduce James Tapscott, who's going to tell us more about his artwork and the Aura Veil column, if you would. James, thank you.
Great, yeah, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be a part of this. So my work for the last maybe 14 or 15 years or so has been really finding ways to combine light with the natural world and really familiar kind of natural elements and experiences and presenting them in a completely new way, but done quite simply so that it can create a more of a profound and open-minded experience about the things that we kind of take for granted. If we can go to the PowerPoint. So this is the work that's in the Aesthetica Prize, and it's kind of the most recent thing that I've done exploring my connection to water, and it's also made me realise that even though I've been working with light for the whole period of this part of my practice, I've also been working with water quite intensely as well. And this work actually takes water from a lake that's not far from where I live in Melbourne, that's apparently quite often referred to as being Melbourne's dirtiest water. And I wanted to try and represent it in a completely different way and found that it's actually really quite beautiful. It has this perfect sort of golden glow about it and a really unique kind of colour content that doesn't actually settle from sediment. It just sort of stays suspended within the water. So it kind of created a really interesting opportunity to produce a sculpture like this and have the water kind of housed within this sort of an architectural reference, like a column, which is kind of a reference to like an old way of seeing and a very rigid sort of structural way of perceiving things. And it was sort of born from an ongoing experimentation with water that I'd find in different sites and present in different containers, sort of triangular containers, to try and present the water as just basically a pure gradient of colour and an experience of just pure phenomena. And found it a really interesting kind of project that kicked on for about a year or so, and then COVID happened and it all got derailed, and I just managed to get the column done before everything closed down here in Australia. Yeah, that was the first one that I tried in different sort of creeks and rivers, and found different ways. It's sort of always a chaotic kind of experimental process working with nature in this way. So it kind of takes a long time for a work to develop, exploring different kinds of water and how they react to being in a container like this. But yeah, I've been sort of doing that for about 12 years or so, and this is a earlier work, one of the first works that I did out in nature, working with light and the environment, and I sort of just introduced a gentle material to the space that was soft enough to be moved by the tides. This is a salt lake, again about 4 hours north of Melbourne. And I embedded a light within the surface of the salt lake in a gentle arc that was about 100 meters long, and I left it there for a month and came back, and then the flow of the tide throughout the site had sort of moved it and formed this new landmass and encrusted the site. And yeah, it really taught me an interesting way about working with the landscape with that one there. And this is another sort of photographic project that's a sort of an ongoing thing, using light and river systems to draw or sort of do light painting experiments. There's another one at a beach, so you can see the sequence of time in these images as well. This is basically two waves that have flown through the floating lights and moved them and then let them settle in the sand, so they stay solid. So it's about a 1 minute exposure shot. This is another sort of experiment for what became one of my more famous works over the last few years, just trying to explore reflections and the idea of an immersive space that's made up of purely just water and light. And this is the final result of a work that was installed in China in 2018 that's made of mist and light, so that the mist basically collects on the floor and turns into a giant puddle which reflects the ring to form a full circle, and becomes a totally immersive experience that you can walk inside and move around in. And a previous version of a similar work using mist and light again. So it's always sort of a really simplified combination of materials to produce these really intense kind of profound experiences is what I'm always aiming to do, that are really sensitive to the site that they're in as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And so, yeah, exploring with this work in particular, the material of acrylic, which is kind of a new thing, and it's led to a few other experiments I'm going to be trying out in my studio over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, just different kinds of vessels for holding different kinds of water. Yeah, that's it. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment after this, this long process of exploring all these materials and just continued experimentation.
Thanks, James. I've been jotting a few notes down there to ask you about. I'm interested in your use of materials and acrylic and things like that as well, because it's interesting when you're working in the landscape, and you've said obviously COVID has touched your practice as well. So I think that's a question we'll come back to at the end. So from one Australian landscape to another, we'll immediately go to Alice Duncan, who's going to share 6 minutes of her practice as well, please. Thanks, James.
Thanks.
Hi, Alice.
Great, thank you. Yes, so hello. My name is Alice Duncan. I'm also calling in from Melbourne. I might just start by formally acknowledging the traditional owners of the country from which I'm calling in from, people of the Woiwurrung, Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty on this land was never ceded. So tonight I've got a little presentation that I might get up if that's all right, Matt. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the work with the Prize, and maybe give like a bit of background as well into how I created that work and the processes and methods that led me there. So through my practice, I'm really trying to expose the multifaceted, ever-changing, and in my opinion, most importantly, the constructed nature of our cultural identities through this complex and ongoing narrative of landscape photography. My research is really underlined by the assumption that landscape photography is never innocent, but instead reflects and reinforces contemporary social and political issues. So I try and utilise photography, ready-made materials and some site-specific installation to try and visualise the complexities involved in collectively living on colonised land like Australia. I'll get back to this. This is the making of it. So I'm currently undertaking my PhD examining the role of photography in contributing towards notions of Australian national identity. I'm particularly interested in questioning Western perceptions of the Australian outback as being a barren landscape that's unmarked by human habitation and void of culture. So I really want to create work that sort of investigates how these representations negate multiple narratives of place, especially histories of Indigenous habitation and colonial violence. So this project, Black Holes Lake Mungo, was really inspired by a previous body of work I created called Picnic at Nanyalong, in which I explore sites of historical violence using this Victoria massacre map. So this is a topographical map that shows the known killings of Aborigines by Europeans in the 19th century across Victoria, where I live. So I began a process of photographing sites on this map that were now used for leisure, and where these histories of violence have been whitewashed by easy to digest colonial narratives or activities. Maybe the most recognisable is, Strathbogie Ranges, which is Ned Kelly country. I wonder if I've got, and there's Picnic at Hanging Rock, which we all know as the book and the movie, I'm sure, of a group of white young women becoming lost in the Australian landscape. It's probably important to note that I'm not just interested in revisiting the history of violence within these landscapes, but I realised that many of these sites were far more complex and stirring than the prescribed colonial narratives really made them out to be. So photographing these sites with a new perspective of their history really strengthened my resolve to explore new ways of representing the Australian landscape. Because after all, if it's, no matter whether it's violent or pleasant or, it's a history that we all inherit in this country. So following on from this work, I've focused on the landscape of Lake Mungo in New South Wales, which sits on the traditional lands of the Barkindji, Mati Mati and Nyampa people. This work was made in consultation with a lot of the traditional owners up there as well. It's a landscape that represents a really important and often overlooked place within Australia, a natural landmark. In the 1960s, ancient human remains were discovered at this site, and since then, Lake Mungo has sort of become the backdrop of an ongoing and often tense dialogue between Aboriginal people and settlers within Australia. And it's an interesting conversation because it really connects Australia's more recent past since colonisation with a much deeper history. So for this series, I began exploring ways in which I could introduce the black hole into the photograph itself. I was using hole punches for my work, with Picnic at Nanyalong, hole punching the negative and scanning it in to create physical intrusions within the landscape and the photograph. But for this work, I sort of explored interrupting the landscape itself with this black hole. So I used a material called Vanta Black and a circular canvas that I created and physically installed this, what I call black hole, or these voids into the landscape itself. In this way, these holes sort of become act as erasures and additives within the landscape, I guess. On one hand, they're sort of removing information from the photograph, acting like a barrier, preventing the viewer from, reading into the image. But on the other hand, they sort of add information. They stand within the landscape like an object or a figure, where a black mark on a photograph would normally signify damage or a fault to the negative or the image. In this instance, it's becoming the subject matter and very much a part of the photograph. It raised some interesting conversations with traditional owners when I was bringing this circle into the landscape. While I was referring to it as empty and a void, an elder told me that they would often use a circle in paintings to represent a meeting place or a ceremonial site. So it felt like these conversations were really solidifying the black hole as a motif for visualizing these complexities, involved in sharing this landscape. So I'm just involved in creating a process, I guess, of additives and erasures that are a response to this overarching Eurocentric narrative present throughout, ubiquitous landscape photography, and trying to sort of push the medium beyond that and reveal and reflect on contemporary dialogues around land use, specifics of place and past histories. Yeah, and that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. That's really interesting to watch, and I watched your video as well last night. So for everybody, if you do get a chance to watch all the videos as well that the artists have made, it's really, really interesting to hear more about their practice as well on the Aesthetica website. I found that very interesting to think about photography in terms of exploring the narrative of really important landmarks as well. So that could be something that we look to chat about as well, exploring different ways and different mediums that are used to explore those very difficult and challenging landscapes. And one of the nice things about our next artists, who are Caesar and Lewis Collective, they are exploring the relationship to nature, I suppose. So our last three artists very much exploring the landscape. So would you like to be, last but not least, our artists who tell us some more about exploring those landscapes? So Caesar and Lewis, you're on.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for these lovely presentations. We are really glad to be here. We have some slides. Oh, yeah. So my name is Cesar. I'm from Brazil. I live in São Paulo.
Yes, and I'm Lucy H.G. Solomon. I'm based in California. I am the Lois of Cesar and Lois.
Yes, as an art collective, we think about what it means to be human. And in this context of the Anthropocene and climate crisis, responding to this context, we put together technological networks, microbiological entities, and social systems.
Biological growth over human texts, as the organism Physarum polycephalum grows over the pages of a book. The organism grows over the text and revises that text. And that revised text is then output on Twitter with gradually disappearing characters and words. At the same time, an AI learns from the microbiological growth patterns and seeks out and destroys internet texts. Within the installation, we use specific books that proclaim humanity's superiority over nature. And in this case, in this particular image, we have Descartes, who the organism is growing over this text, and Descartes means the lords and possessors of nature. The organism grows over the text and it rewrites it in a sense. It then tweets it out as a new version. And within the installation, there's a printer. This is a thermal printer that prints the live Twitter feed from the Twitter handle, Hello Fungus.
Yes, and this is the digital component of the system. It shows an AI that's based on microbiological organism growth. This AI searches on the internet for text that talks about this humanity desire to dominate nature. Instead of basing an AI on the human needs, nature becomes a basis for this AI logic. So Physarum polycephalum, the microorganism that grows across the text, is considered an intelligent organism, and from a lot of scientific research. It's a cellular system that can solve mazes and also shares resources equitably across every node in its network. So we have studied this organism in laboratories and grown it in different countries for different installations. And in each version of this installation, the AI focus on some local environmental issues. So in Brazil, for example, we focused on the human interventions on the Amazon, in the Amazon. And in Aesthetica Future Now exhibition, the AI will seek out texts on human interventions connected to the rise of sea levels. Here is the documentation of the generative cultures in Singapore, where the AI focus on weather manipulation and cloud seeding. This artwork is an AI and also bioart. However, what we really are proposing in this work is the concept of an ecosystemic intelligence. Instead of an AI, this would be an EI.
Yes, we're thinking a lot about how microorganisms make their decisions in more equitable ways and asking a question, what would happen if human systems and technological systems had that same kind of law? We're thinking about the future of our human systems and the future of humanity and our relationship to the planet. And this also thinking about the history of certain elements of human logic that brought us to the current climate crisis. This history is recorded in philosophical texts that are part of modern epistemology. And so the books really represent this trove of human knowledge and gets written by the collaborative actions of organisms and AI. Microbiological and artificial intelligence in this way consume human knowledge. And we invite people during the installation to engage with the project by getting onto Twitter. And in this way, they can interact with the digital fungus and help to spread the digital spores of the project.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's gives a concise idea of this project. But we can talk more about it.
I know. There's so many questions I want to ask about that. It's such a fascinating. To me, it's such a new area. When I first saw this, it's so many areas that I'm interested in science and art, and how you sort of bringing the audience again when we're talking about audience engagement, or I was, because I love that audience engagement, how you bring that in and how you can start exploring, how people exploring your ideas as well. So I'm really fascinated by that and how that will continue through the sort of time we're going through. So first, before we go into discussion, everybody stuck to their time, so thank you so much. I think Cherie's about right. We've got 22 minutes left. So thank you all very much. I found that fascinating, and I hope everybody out there who's listening has also found that's amazing. We have so many brilliant artists from across the world there, and sharing all their ideas and sharing their art, and it's just been wonderful hearing about that. And what a year we've been and are going through. And that's sort of one of my first questions, really, about how the pandemic has affected your work. And I'll probably start with Andrew, because he talked and touched upon that a little bit, that his practice actually changed actually what he was painting. So do you want to start, Andrew, and tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'll jump in just to say that it's kind of changed what I do in terms of my painting from the ground up. Everything about what I did changed. The subject matter changed. The way that I was thinking about what I was doing changed. The way that I went about going about it as well. From ordering my art supplies to, which actually ended up becoming a really big thing, because and I kind of touched on this in the talk. Previously, I was traveling and I would go to historic house museums and I would paint old things, right? Like old things in museums. And so one thing that really changed was my palette, for instance. I started using these really bright colors as I was beginning to paint these synthetic objects. So, but then the way that I would go about getting my paints, for instance, from the art store was different too, because I would have to order everything online. And what I was having to do is get these ranges of colors that were very bright so that they could match these synthetic kind of fake plastic colors. So I would have to get like the brightest tubes of paint colors that I possibly could. And I would have to experiment at home and kind of try and not get it right. And then I would have to order more supplies from the art store because, again, I'm trying not to go anywhere. And then maybe have to wait a couple of days for new supplies to come in and then do experiments with that. And then perhaps it would be the color that I wanted. So just even little things like that changed completely. Yeah, and I mean that's really just one subject matter because I really started going back and looking at Vanitas paintings and trying to create a new series that looks at food and Vanitas a little bit more in focus. So
yeah, and it has been such a thing that we've all started looking at, haven't we? I suppose, and that's what reflected in your artwork. That that idea about food and suddenly becoming really possessive about tins of beans and toilet rolls and things that are in our freezers. And you've sort of captured that, so it has changed that mood. And similarly, James, you were talking about how you sort of almost had to go and get your art in, didn't you, because of having it out there. So it's changed your practice in some way?
Yeah, it did. Well, sort of delayed it more than anything else. I had quite a few projects lined up that were either cancelled or postponed that are sort of kicking off again this year. I mean, Melbourne was probably one of the most locked down cities in the world for quite a lot of last year. We were barely even allowed to leave the house for about 6 months of last year. So it made everything really difficult. I mean, for me as well, needing to really get out in the landscape and always going on sort of site scouting missions around Victoria to find new places to work and new ways of working, that kind of couldn't really happen. But I mean, for me, I was about halfway through building a new studio out the back of my house. So it gave me an opportunity to really just focus on that and get that done. And kind of, get into a studio rather than out into the world, which has really actually led me to producing the sculptural work that's in the Aesthetica Prize, and focus more on a different avenue of my practice to do more sort of objective works that are studio based. But now that things are opening up, I've got back out into nature and planning a few other projects as well. So it was just kind of really almost like a pause for a year, and hopefully get things getting back to normal, at least around here anyway. But yeah, definitely a difficult one.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we've all sort of changed, and I suppose made us reflect, like you say, on different ways that we're working from home or different media. And I was wondering, as we were listening to Monica's and Caesar and Lucy's, how, has it changed in the way that we use technology? Are you looking at different ways that we can that you can sort of apply new technologies to your work? So if we go to Caesar and Lewis first, would you say there's any changes that you're exploring? And then maybe to Monica, is that okay? Do you want to go first?
Yes.
Caesar? Yeah. Lewis, yeah.
I would say that one of the aspects of being in a local place all the time is that we started to look for environmental systems as a basis for intelligence that are in front of our eyes. And so that has meant actually taking plant specimens in our local environments, distilling them, studying them, and trying to glean what is the time scale embedded in these different systems for integrated intelligence. If we're thinking about artificial intelligence that really takes its logic and its cues from different parts in nature, we thought maybe this time of being stuck, in a sense, would allow us to zoom in on parts of our nature. And I'll let Cesar comment as well.
I like the phrase being stuck. We're almost stuck.
Yeah, this thing is interesting because we started to think about other temporalities, how nature can bring us to another time scale, because we are used to work in the time scale of the economy, of the social meetings and the schedule of our work, for example, but now we have to be in the time scale of this virus, of its wave. So it also informed very much our work. Not precisely degenerative cultures, but we created electronic cycles. That's a work that respond to this other temporality.
Yeah, thank you. Monica, have you got anything to add about that as well? Because it will have changed your practice. Thank you.
Yes, I think it was pretty much about rethinking our position in nature for me. And as we start talking about a post-pandemic world, if it's even possible to start talking about that, how important it is to go forward, not only rethinking and reimagining, but acting upon that and truly go back into the world with a different attitude towards nature, I think. So based on that, through my work, I've discovered a very important connection related to race equality and ecological justice, and how we will not be able to achieve ecological justice without racial equality. I think, if anything, that was the very much present series of thoughts that I had throughout the last year. And so one of the projects I'm working on now is a reflection on that and on slowing down, on really embracing a slower way of making work and a slower pace of life and connecting truly in a different way.
Yeah, there is something in that, and that it reminds me of Alice's work. Now, I'm fascinated about how you're exploring and telling the narrative of this, and like Monica's just said about how we're telling that story and how we can do it justice, I suppose. And I was quite interested in, because I know you work in photography and installation, but maybe if you could chat a little bit about, the use of photography and why photography. Is there any other mediums that you would want to explore? As Monica said, in this post-pandemic world, to start telling that story?
Yeah, interesting question. I guess for me, photography is a medium that I've always used. I used to work as a commercial photographer, and it was only really when I started photographing the landscape that I sort of learned and realized the colonial underpinnings involved in photography, and looking into the history of the camera as a tool for capturing others, and what that means, and maybe finding a way that I could speak about the landscape in another way or photograph it in another way was really interesting. So I sort of came to this more sort of social aspect of art making through photography, which in itself is a tool of colonialism historically. So yeah, like a really interesting sort of way of developing that project. But in terms of looking at other mediums at the moment, the pandemic has proven really hard because a lot of states in Australia shut their borders between states, and I'm travelling between Victoria and New South Wales for this project. So I was sort of relying on technology to, keep up to date and communicate with some of these traditional owners and custodians. But for a lot of people in these communities, high-speed internet is not a thing. It was the pandemic, while it forced us to go online and communicate with each other. For a lot of people out there, it really was not possible. So it made me think about who technology really benefits, and maybe finding ways of allowing others who might need communication, or to develop that communication, finding ways of allowing that through technology. I think that was sort of the biggest thing I was thinking about throughout COVID and our lockdowns. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it is that I like that idea. Who's the communication for, and who's it benefiting, I suppose. And there is something that, and I'd like to go to Chris as well to talk about, because you're sort of is with an audience, isn't it? With an audience in mind, I suppose. But I also love the way when you were talking about what your equipment was sort of made out of, and maybe you can sort of share a bit more about that as well, because I think that sort of resonates with what I enjoyed about your piece. So could you chat a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And let me just really quickly double back and second the comments about photography being a tool of colonialism. I used to work at a certain yellow bordered magazine in the photo department, and I can absolutely vouch for the colonializing effects of it. I mean, it's been a complicated history for them to unpack. And as far as technology goes, like, it's interesting to me that so many seemingly democratizing technologies really just serve to amplify existing power systems. When you think of, for example, car sharing, or ride sharing, I should say, other sort of gig work really sort of benefits those who are already in power. It might change the specific selection of who is in power, but it still amplifies the existing hierarchy, and if anything, worsens it. So it's easy to look sort of critically at these democratizing technologies. I also do think that on some level, some of them really are democratizing. It's complicated. There's no clear answers here. Like, for example, this is a Raspberry Pi device. This is a computer, believe it or not. It's about the size of a credit card, a little bit fatter than one, of course. It's made by a nonprofit foundation based in the UK. And it is sold for school children, again, to be able to learn from and figure out how to become software developers just by messing around and having fun. It costs $35 US. I'm not sure what it costs in other currencies, but it's not a whole lot of money. So if you fry it as an 8-year-old, you're not in that much trouble. But at the same time, who is really getting access to these devices? I would like to think that it is getting to currently underserved communities, but I'm not sure whether that's true or not. I'm not sure how widely it's being distributed. We also can look at, say, the MIT Media Lab's creation of the one laptop per child. I think Nicholas Negroponte maybe was the sort of main architect of that, but many others worked on it. Idea being that you had at that time, very inexpensive laptop that was hand cranked, so you could power it anywhere, including places that had no power. But it also required all of this additional infrastructure sort of passively near it. And I'm not sure that they were successful in actually getting it into the hands of people who had no such infrastructure nearby. So it's easy to make things that seem democratic on their face, but are not necessarily.
Oh, there's so much to go on. I wish we had longer. I've been given the 10-minute window, and I want to go deeper into all these things. But one of the things that I know lots of artists, but it was this time last year when we actually had the Aesthetica Art Prize in person, and there were so many young and emerging artists who attended the talks, and I know some of their questions were about, have you got any top tips for artists? So I wonder if anybody's got any top tips for artists that are emerging, and or it could be something about the prize, why you entered the prize, and to encourage people that be watching today and give them your top tips. So if I come to you again, Chris, you've just given us some wonderful things to think about. But what's your top tips for somebody watching today?
Well, I stole this tip from The Onion. They start their pieces with writing the headline. And if you don't write the headline, you don't really have much of something that anyone will see. Like, no one will click on it. You're not really sure sort of what the idea is. Then this may well be unique to my way of working, but I like to be able to, at least partway through a piece, really just be able to summarize it quickly and explain what it's about. And that's not necessarily something you have to actually share with anybody, but just for myself. Like, I like to know what I'm really getting at with something. Other people get to their work through more meandering and like an exploratory process, and that may well work for you, but consider writing a headline for your piece.
I love that. I'm going to use that myself, I think. I'm going to go to Monica. I'm going to try and get through everybody in 10 minutes. Monica, what's your top tip?
I think entering prizes is a really good way of showing your work, and not being disappointed if you don't get through. I mean, I think I apply for so many things every month, and you get only through a very few of these, if any, in a year. So I think if you are recently graduating, just enter as much as you can, as many prizes, as many exhibitions, as many reviews. Show your work as many times as you can. I think for me that was a big, the big learning curve when I graduated. Not to now kind of let it kind of go for a month or something. I kind of went on and kept on showing work, and share it as much as you can with your community. You know, communities are also very important.
Thank you, Monica. I like that one as well. And it keeps that momentum going, doesn't it? It really does keep the momentum going. So, yeah. Andrew, I'll go to you next, please. A top tip for those out there.
Well, maybe a top tip would be using what you have to make work. And if you're not able to go out into the world and have all the access to your typical resources, then use what you have at home too, and just maybe reconsider your ideas and don't get too stuck in one avenue or like one idea or one thought, but we'd be willing to kind of work outside of that and try new things.
Oh, that's a good one, I think, particularly at the moment, isn't it? Try and use what we've got. Right, I'm going to whiz to James and see what he's got.
I guess the main thing I would advise is just to be patient, I think, and just really take your time in finding your own voice as an artist and doing it for yourself, and just exploring what really interests you and what makes you passionate, and try not to overreact to what's going on around you so that you can, keep pushing your own unique kind of make your own unique journey in the world. As an artist, I think that's the most important thing, and where you really develop something special to offer the world.
Thank you. I like that one. Patience, because
Yeah.
that's my middle name as well. So I like patience. Thank you. I'm going to try and get everybody in. I'm going to say a big thank you now because we'll get cut off at 3. So I want to say a huge thank you, but I'm going to rush around and see if we can get a top tip from Alice, please.
Oh gosh. I'm going to quote one of my favorite teachers who said, I think I was having trouble with the work. I used to think that, I would make a work and finish the work and that would be it. And he told me once that you start scratching the surface of an idea and all you get is more surface. And I think that's really important to remember, not to look at art making as sort of individual chapters of works that start and finish, but, an artwork is never finished. And sometimes it's not until you take a step back and realize that the process was really the work sometimes. Yeah, so just...
I like that one too. These are great. I'm going to use all these, I think. And we'll go to finally Caesar and Lois, please. Who's going to answer? Or are you both going to try and get a bit in each?
Just to be very fast, I would say be curious. Be curious about everything and always change your perspective. So this dialectical thing is very important to change our perspective about how to see the world that's around us.
Thank you. I like that as well. These are great, especially for these times. Come on, Lois, you can have the last word if you like.
I would say to definitely pursue all the connections with potential collaborators across disciplines, with people who may push you and prod you, and to frame what you at first perceive as failures as process, as something that you can engage with as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. And thank all our artists today. Monica, Andrew, Chris, James, Alice, Caesar and Lois, thank you so much. Thank you for your top tips. They will be so useful to everybody out there listening. As I say, do go on and watch their videos, which I watched last night. They're fantastic. So they would take that away with us. Good on change perspective. Start scratching the surface. You get more surface. Use what you have. Be patient, curious, apply yourself. And I like Chris's onion. All of us should be an onion as well. So thank you for that. And thank you, everybody, for today. I look forward to watching the rest of Symposium and seeing you all soon. So thank you for entering the Art Prize. And thank you for your time today. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.